Hello and welcome to this short video, Minimally Processed Foods. Now, my name's Andy Bowles and I'm a food lawyer. This is the 34th video in a series of 100 on UK food law topics that I'm recording. And you may be watching this as part of our online training service, in which case you've got access to additional resources to support this video. Also, you can watch a webinar which is about an hour long and goes into far more detail on the topic. If you're watching this on our YouTube channel, you are of course very welcome. So what are minimally processed foods? These are foods that are going to be consumed either raw or they've gone through a heat treatment that is less than the normal cooking process one would associate in a commercial kitchen. So they might have gone through a light pasteurization or light treatment. The Food Standards Agency likes to refer to these sort of products as less than thoroughly cooked. What sort of products are we talking about? Could be steak tartare, which is minced beef with a bit of raw egg on top. It could be carpaccio, which is thinly sliced meat or fish. It could be eggs benedict, for example, or a whole range of other foods that are going to be consumed raw or lightly cooked. So what are the food safety hazards associated with consumption? Well, typically we're talking about food poisoning bacteria such as Salmonella, E. coli 157, Campylobacter. Could be foodborne viruses in the case of shellfish, so norovirus, hepatitis A. It might be parasites in the case of raw fish. Of course, these are well associated with these raw foods, and if you're going to place a food on the market without going through a thorough cooking process, then those hazards need to be properly controlled. So how can they be controlled? Well, the first place of visit really is the HACCP system. You should have an adequate systems based on HACCP principles. So a food safety risk assessment. If you're not familiar with HACCP, there is a separate video on this. But it's not just the risk assessment, because we can all look at, for example, the hazard Salmonella associated with beef, and then go through a HACCP process where we can identify various controls to be put in place. But often it's actually the prerequisites to HACCP that are critical here. So getting materials in, raw materials of adequate quality, making sure that the materials are handled hygienically, hand washing amongst staff handling these sorts of products, for example, becomes really important. Proper storage, particularly temperature control. Staff being adequately trained so they understand that when you're dealing with foods that are minimally processed, then, if you like, the hazards associated with foods are sort of amplified. And information to the consumer. At the end of the day, if there is still a residual risk of the hazards being present in a food that's being placed on the market, the consumer needs to be made aware of that. So let's just revisit some of those. Quality and materials. Of course, if you're dealing with foods that are going to be placed on the market minimally processed, then the materials need to be of absolute A1 quality. An example of that would be if you've watched the video that I've done on less than thoroughly cooked beef burgers. You will know in the UK there is a legal requirement. Should a business decide to place on the market a less than thoroughly cooked beef burger, and they are not going to use a cooking process equivalent to 70 degrees for 2 minutes, which is the recommended time temperature combination for cooking beef in the UK. If they're not going to do that, they're going to use a time temperature combination less than that, then the beef or the minced beef must be supplied by a business that has been specifically approved by the authorities for such supply. In other words, it's really trying to assure that the minced beef will be supplied salmonella free, and they will have to put in place adequate provisions, including appropriate storage and transport, to meet those sort of standards. So for those situations where less than thoroughly cooked beef burgers are being placed on the market, where the heat treatment is not equivalent to 70 for 2 minutes, they need to put in this extra element of assurance of supply. Other assurance of supply can be found in things like shellfish. If you've got oysters, oysters will be consumed raw, but of course oysters have to be harvested from properly controlled waters. They will need to go through either a purification or a relaying process to remove contaminants, and then go through a dispatch centre where an identification mark will be applied to them. If you're a retailer, caterer or whatever, and you're using raw oysters, you need to make sure that the identification mark is actually supplied with the oysters, so you can draw on the assurances that those oysters are being sourced from an appropriate place. You also are under obligation to retain that identification mark on site should the authorities need access to it. So supply is really important. Handling. Well, often when dealing with less than thoroughly cooked products, minimally processed, if you want to use that term, contamination can be on the outer surface. For example, beef. I put that on a list of one of the concerns is E. coli 157 and salmonella. That's two of the concerns, isn't it? Anyway, if you have a joint of beef, the microbial contamination will be on the outside of the joint. So really, the issue is if you're going to make a steak tartare and mince it all up, before you mince it, you need to remove the contamination from the external surface. That can be done from a number of ways. You can blanch it, you can drop it into a pot of boiling water. You can trim it. You can just trim off the outer surface. You can sear the outside by putting it into a hot pan, just making sure. You can, this is not a good one, wash it. The concern about washing when you're dealing with contaminated meat is that you might end up contaminating the whole environment by splashing all the water around. So washing is not usually the best option. Typically you'll find where steak tartare is being served up that the business will go through either a blanching or a trimming, or a blanching and trimming, or a trimming and searing. So there might be several steps to it. They sear the beef and then cut off the seared part of the beef and then mince it up. So you're removing the external part of the beef joint. That's the bit where the contamination is likely to be present. Of course, having removed the contaminated part, you need to make sure staff wash their hands and that you have proper controls to prevent cross-contamination in place. Storage. If you're making something like steak tartare, you've gone to the trouble of removing the external contamination, you've minced your meat in really careful conditions, then you need to make sure that it's stored adequately. Now, of course, temperature control is key, so storing such products at 8 degrees below is really, really important. However, prevention of cross-contamination is also key, and I would suggest that if you're dealing with products like steak tartare, you're introducing a third category of food into your catering environment. Because normally you think of raw foods like raw chicken, you think of ready-to-eat foods like a cooked meat, and you would make sure that they are kept separate. So your cooked meats and your raw chicken will be kept absolutely separate, so you can't get contamination from the raw food to the ready-to-eat food. That's fair enough, basic principle of hygiene. But here we're introducing a third category. It's a raw and ready-to-eat food. What you want to make sure is that your raw and ready-to-eat food is separated from raw foods. You don't want your raw chicken contaminating your steak tartare. But also there is a residual risk. It might be small, but there is still a residual risk about perhaps from salmonella, perhaps from other concerns in something like steak tartare that a consumer ordering that food is willing to accept. You don't treat, in my view, steak tartare in the same way as a cooked meat. A cooked meat should be safe, that's the end of it. Steak tartare, yeah, of course it should be safe, but there is this residual risk. So therefore it should be kept away from other ready-to-eat foods because it could contaminate other ready-to-eat foods, even if it is in a very marginal way. Providing information to consumers is just an adequate, it's to supplement controls. It's not a substitute. In UK law, certainly in England and Wales, which is my area of law, you cannot get a customer to sign away their rights. You can't say to them, look, you've ordered steak tartare, so therefore can you just sign a bit of paper to say if you're ill, it's your fault. It doesn't work in law. There's no defence in law. No one can sign away their sort of rights in respect to personal injury or death or something of that nature. The obligation is on you as a food business operator to take all reasonable precautions and exercise all due diligence when respect to serving up these types of foods. So as part of a reasonable precaution, having gone through a proper process where you're steak tartare has been trimmed, it's been seared, it's been properly minced, it's been kept in lovely cold conditions, your staff have been well trained and they've washed their hands, the environment is lovely and clean, it's been kept away from other foods, then these are all reasonable precautions. The last reasonable precaution is just to tell the consumer, look, this food is made from raw meat, so they understand there's a residual risk. Now, in general food law, there is an acceptance that people are reasonably well informed and reasonably circumspect. So you don't have to put a skull and crossbones on your menu or something, warning people if you eat your steak tartare you may die. You don't have to do anything like that. All you need to do is make sure the consumer is adequately informed of what they're eating. In my view, if you're placing steak tartare on the menu, then you should at a minimum just say it's made from raw beef. You know, people know raw beef is, there is a residual risk eating raw beef. So if you have finely chopped raw beef mixed with shallots, capers, raw egg yolk and cognac, the customer is being advised it's a raw meat product. They can make up their own mind. You'll know that when dealing with less than thoroughly cooked burgers, the Food Standards Agency recommend statements to the consumer, just pointing out that this has not gone through a thorough heat treatment, therefore there might be a residual risk or something along those lines. It's entirely up to you how you do it, but you must remember the information is just to supplement the controls. It's just the last issue just to make the consumer aware. It is not a defence in law and it doesn't pass the responsibility onto the consumer. Okay, right, well thank you for watching that. As I say, you may want to have a look at a webinar on our online training service, which goes on about an hour and a bit more detail on this topic. Thanks very much for watching. Catch you on the next video. Cheers.